Welcome to this week's lecture about fascism. So, fascism, unlike some of the other ideologies that we've studied so far that have their roots back in the 1800s, 1900s, etc., fascism is relatively more recent, coming into prominence in that inter-World War I and World War II period, and particularly practiced during World War II, right? Spain, Portugal, Italy, Nazi Germany are countries that tend to be associated with fascism, and they certainly were. Although I will say in the Spanish case under Francisco Franco, while the Spanish regime started off as being fascist, Franco really just kind of co opted a whole bunch of people and did pretty much whatever he could to stay in power, which meant that Spain, after several years of his rule, really didn't look like the type of fascism that we saw in Italy and Nazi Germany. So, what are the main characteristics of fascism? Well, we can think of it as being authoritarian, right? We can think of it as being very militaristic and a very right wing kind of nationalism. So, unlike some of the other ideologies that we've encountered so far, fascism really sees society and the nation as a living organism, and who is at the head is the supreme leader. Now, what that means is that if you have all of society as one living organism and you have the leader as the head, that means you can't have the arms and the legs doing something on their own. So there's no civil society, right? Everybody is subsumed under the leadership of this one supreme leader. And so it's a system that's very illiberal. So it's really anti-liberal in the sense that the individual really has no rights. The needs of the nation and the state very much come before the needs of the individual. And it's also anti-communist. So there are some slight overlaps with socialism in terms of like collectivism and anti-capitalism, but social or fascism rather really rejected the material focus of socialism and instead talked about more of a spiritual life, especially a very nationalist life. And while orthodox communism, as we learned about last week, ended up being totalitarian, fascism was expressly totalitarian from the start. There was no evenness, no hand waving at all about equality. So here you have a definition of what a totalitarian regime is. And one of the core themes of fascism, and here's Mussolini here in this photo, is that it had a very counter-enlightenment approach. So emotions and instincts, rather than reason and thought, were supposed to come first. Mussolini was quoted as saying, action, not thought, and inactivity is death, right? So it's a very intellectual, it's a very anti type of ideology: anti-intellectual, anti-liberal, anti-conservative, anti-capital, also anti-communist. And again, here we see that organic community coming in where you have these emotional bonds and all of the truth, right? If we're not relying on reason and fact, well, where do we get our truth from? It's from the leader and what the leader has decided to tell us. Fascism also really focuses on struggle, right? So not the cooperation and community that we saw with socialism, but really with struggle, that conflict and war are necessary, right? You should get rid of the weak because they hold the nation back. Hitler was quoted as saying, victory is to the strong and the weak must go to the wall. Another core theme of fascism has to do with who is allowed to be in charge and how that influences how society is organized. So per fascism, you basically have three types of people in society, right? You have your supreme leader who knows everything that needs to be done, right? Has unrivaled authority. Then you have a warrior elite class who's exclusively male, and then pretty much everybody else, right? The weak, the people who are ignorant. The only thing that they should focus on in their lives is basically obeying what the supreme leader wants them to do as is enforced by the warrior elite, right? So there's no room for dissent. Now, this is a little bit controversial, but according to Mussolini and Hitler, what they were proposing, some of their ideas they claimed were socialist, right? But this is a claim that's pretty much rejected by all socialists. So what was kind of similar when it comes to fascism and socialism? Well, there are some similarities, right? Socialism and fascism both are anti-capitalist. They both believe that just unfettered capitalism is bad, right? There also is an emphasis on collectivism in both fascism and socialism, but fascists definitely were not focused on the same common themes, right? As you can see just by this point in the lecture that we've gotten so far, there's nothing about the themes of socialism like equality and community and cooperation and common ownership and classes, right? Not the same themes at all. Definitely no focus on equality, because remember, society is like a living organism with a head, so you can't have different parts of the body doing whatever they want because the head needs to be in charge, right? So no equality at all. And so, yes, fascism talked about anti-capitalism, but it was really because capitalism was meant to be used by the nation, right? It was meant to be something that the state could control. And yes, fascism talked about collectivism, but it was a collective nation, right? And as we'll see in the next couple slides, and as was in practice, right, especially in Nazi Germany, who was a part of that nation was very limited, right? So according to fascism, it's the nation and not the working class that comes first. And fascism was also very much anti-communist. It was really about national integration and unity, and definitely not about this international working class solidarity. Another core theme of fascism is this idea of ultranationalism. Now, we will talk about nationalism in a few weeks, but the way that fascism interpreted it, again, we're thinking about society as a living organism, and there's a call for this rebirth of the nation, right? You had this glorious past, and the past, this glorious time of your nation was subjugated, and people were doing very poorly, and so you need to rebirth this new national past, this new man rising from the ashes. Return to greatness through war and conquest. Again, we see those themes of struggle again. Any outsiders or dissenters are going to be seen as threats. And so it's actually very good per fascist to engage in expansionist wars, right? So not wars of defense where you're just defending your territory from external threat, but you are going on the offensive and you're taking over territory of other states, aka other countries, because you want to build up your own ultranationalist state. And so here are some ways in which fascism and liberalism differ, just to kind of give you a sense of how those two theories relate to, or two ideologies rather, relate to each other, right? The state's definitely more important than any individual and any individual rights that liberalism really focused on. Definitely no individual freedom or equality, right? And equality would be something that we would expect also of socialism. There needs to be a hierarchy because you have these three classes of people, and just, it's too bad for you if you're born into that, the mass class as opposed to being the leader or the warrior elite. Very anti-democratic, and also promoting state capitalism, right? So the state is the one that's controlling the production and the use of capital, not to promote equality, which is what socialism had envisioned, but to pretty much promote the continued hierarchy of the state. And here you can see where the ideologies fall, right? Where you have classic liberalism being okay with there being low equality, but having a lot of freedom, especially for individuals, right? Communism, as we talked about last week, there is still a focus on equality, but, in practice, you don't have a lot of freedom because you have this dictatorship of the working class, and then orthodox communism ended up producing a vanguard party, and then you got this totalitarian state. But fascism pretty much falls into this low freedom, and low equality quartile, right? Where no expressed interest at all in equality because society is hierarchical. Again, that living organism with the leader as the head. And so very much okay with no equality and no freedom. And then we ended up getting different types of fascism, different flavors, if you will, right? Where you had the extreme racism version of fascist Germany, and then you had the extreme statist version of fascist Italy. Although in reality, what ended up happening is you got totalitarianism, right? And you don't have to be a fascist to be totalitarian, because Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, makes it onto this totalitarian list. But it's just pretty much the state taking over everything. And that's it for this week's lecture.